The city beneath the dried sea. In 2019, a group of geologists was working on the northern edge of a salt desert that locals called the Dead Bottom. On maps, the place looked empty, a white plain, cracked salt, scattered stones, and a horizon that trembled in the daytime heat. No roads, no settlements, no old ruins, only salt. But that was exactly where satellite imaging detected a strange anomaly. Beneath the desert surface, a network of straight lines stretched outward. They were too clean to be natural fractures. They crossed at right angles, formed blocks like streets, and ended near a large circular structure almost in the center of the dried basin. At first, the team assumed it was a processing error. Then they checked the images again. The lines did not disappear. 3 weeks later, a small expedition arrived. 2 geologists, an archaeologist, a drone operator, a ground-penetrating radar technician, and a local guide named Samir. Samir immediately said that it was better not to stay in that part of the desert at night. When they asked why, he answered only this: the water did not leave this place by itself. Nobody took the words seriously. The first day was calm. The drone rose above the white plain and showed what could not be seen from the ground, faint rectangular outlines showing through the salt crust as if the foundations of buildings were buried under a thin white skin. The ground-penetrating radar confirmed it. At a depth of 2 to 4 meters there were cavities, many cavities, and they were not arranged randomly. They looked like rooms inside houses. The first measurements only made the discovery stranger. Beneath the salt there was none of the usual archaeological chaos. No random pits, no collapsed walls, no traces of later nomads. The radar traced clean rooms, corridors, and empty rectangular courtyards. Deeper down, something like a main street appeared, with narrow lanes branching away from it. If the instrument was right, this was not a single temple or a caravan stop. It was a whole city, planned more like a harbor district, except there could not have been a harbor here. The nearest water was more than 300 kilometers away. On the second day, the team began to dig. They removed the salt carefully, layer by layer. Under it was dense gray silt, pressed hard by time. And under the silt, a stone pavement. The archaeologist Markelov knelt down and ran his hand across the slabs. This was not a settlement near the shore, he said. This was a street. Within hours, they cleared almost 20 meters. On both sides of the pavement, house walls appeared. Low doorways, stone steps, broken vessels, traces of wooden beams, reduced to dark stains in the floor. But something else shocked them more than anything. On the wall of one house, a line had survived, a thin blue stripe painted at the height of a human chest. Then they found the same line in a second house. Then in a third. By evening it was clear. The blue stripe ran through the entire quarter. It was a water line. But if the city had been flooded, why was it now beneath a salt desert? And why did the houses look as if the people had not left centuries ago, but suddenly, in a single day? In one room, they found clay bowls standing in a neat circle on the floor. In another, a child's toy shaped like a small boat. In a third, a bundle of bronze keys still hanging from a hook beside the door. Nothing had been looted. Nothing had been prepared for evacuation. The city had not been abandoned. It had been interrupted. In the corner of one house, they found a stone bowl with hardened salt inside it. At the bottom of the bowl was the imprint of a fishbone. In another room lay net weights, dozens of small stones with holes in them, stacked carefully in a wooden box that had decayed into a dark shadow. This no longer looked like coincidence. The city had not merely stood near water, it had lived by water. Its people caught fish, stored boats, marked the tide level on their walls, and perhaps every day looked out at a sea where now there was only dead white ground. On the third day, the expedition reached the circular structure at the center of the anomaly. From the surface, it looked like a low mound of salt. But after clearing it, they uncovered steps spiraling downward. The walls of the stairwell were covered with symbols of waves, fish, and stars. Among them, one sign repeated again and again, a circle cut by a horizontal line. Markelov suggested it might mean the horizon. Samir said it was the mark of a closed sea. At the bottom, the stairs led into a large hall. The ceiling stood on columns decorated with shells and the impressions of sea plants. The floor was made of black stone. In the center was a huge round basin, completely dry. On its bottom lay a stone disc almost 3 meters across. The disc carried a map, not a ritual map, not a symbolic drawing. A real map of a coastline. It showed bays, river mouths, islands, and the line of the shore. The problem was that the modern coastline was hundreds of kilometers away. The geologist Lena compared the drawing with data from ancient lakes and marine basins. Nothing matched. The map showed a sea that, according to official geology, had never existed here, or it had existed far earlier than this city should have been possible. The most disturbing detail was not even that contradiction. The disc also marked depths. Small notches ran along the coast like on modern nautical charts. In the center of the sea was a dark circle, exactly like the structure above the hall. At first, Markelov thought it represented a capital or a temple, but Lena noticed something else. If you read the map as a navigation chart, the dark circle was not on land. It was in the deepest part of the water. In other words, the city may have been built around a place the ancients considered the bottom of the sea. That night, the wind changed. At first, it came from the east, hot and dry. Then suddenly, it turned damp. Drops of moisture appeared on the tents. Condensation formed on the metal cases. The air began to smell of seaweed. The drone operator thought fog must have formed somewhere nearby. But when he switched on the night vision camera, movement appeared on the screen. A person was slowly walking along the excavated street. The silhouette was blurred, as if filmed through a layer of water. It stopped at the door of one of the houses, raised a hand, and vanished. In the morning, they watched the recording 10 times. It was not anyone from the team. There were no footprints in the salt, but the door where the figure had stopped was now slightly open. Inside, they found a staircase leading down. It did not lead to a basement, but to a long, sloping corridor. The walls were covered with the same blue pigment. The deeper the team descended, the stronger the smell of the sea became. After 40 meters, the corridor ended at massive stone gates. There was an inscription on them. They could read only part of it. When the water leaves, do not search for the city. When the city returns, do not open the sea. Behind the gates was a second level of the city. Not ruins, streets, houses, docks, and boats. Dozens of boats stood in a dry underground harbor, tied neatly to stone rings. Their hulls were coated in salt, but their shape had survived almost perfectly. One boat stood out from the rest. It was longer, with a high prow and a black line along the side. Inside it were human remains. Not skeletons. Dried bodies covered in salt. They sat upright, facing the prow, as if waiting to depart. Markelov ordered everyone not to touch anything, but the technician had already noticed a new map on the wall nearby. This map was different from the first. It showed the city, the same city, but around it there was no sea, only desert. Beside it was a date written in ancient signs. When Lena translated it approximately, her face went pale. The date corresponded to our time, not the past. The present. On the 4th day, communication began to fail. First, the satellite phone lost signal for several minutes. Then the GPS started showing that the camp was sometimes in the desert and sometimes in the middle of the sea. When the drone took off, it froze at a height of 10 meters and began transmitting an image of water even though there was salt beneath it. The video showed rooftops, swaying seaweed, and shadows of large fish. A second later, the image disappeared. Samir refused to go below again. He said that as a child he had heard a legend. Once, the sea here had been alive. Not alive because it was full of fish. Alive in itself. It could leave, return, and take the cities that were built too deep. Before leaving, Samir pointed to the blue line in the corridor and said his people had a rule. If you find a wall in the desert with a watermark above the heart, you must not sleep nearby. According to the legend, such a mark does not show an old flood. It shows the boundary to which the water has the right to return. To the scientists, it sounded like superstition. But the instruments were now showing rising humidity in the underground chambers, even though there was no rain, no clouds, and no known aquifer so close to the surface. They laughed at him. But that evening, the salt around the excavation began to darken. Water started seeping from the cracks, first drops, then thin streams. The geologists decided they must have opened an underground reservoir. The team began packing the equipment, and then a sound came from the central hall, deep, stretched out, like the strike of a huge bell underwater. Once, then a second time, then a third. Markelov went down last to retrieve the camera from the map chamber. The operator went with him. They switched on their lights and saw that the basin in the center of the hall was no longer dry. It was filled with dark water. Small bubbles floated on the surface. The stone disc with the map had disappeared beneath the water, and on the walls, above the blue line, new symbols were appearing. The operator zoomed in. The symbols were fresh. They were forming right in front of the camera. Markelov managed to read only one line. The shore is not a place. The shore is a warning. Then the water in the basin rose by a full meter at once. They ran. At the exit from the underground dock, a current was already roaring. The boats trembled on their ancient ropes. The dried bodies in the black boat were no longer sitting straight. Their heads had turned toward the living. The recording cuts off on the stairs. The final camera file was only partially recovered. In several frames, the water is not simply pouring up from below. It rises in a flat wall, as if an invisible bowl is being filled to the old blue line. Just before the footage breaks, the camera catches the stone sign of the closed sea. The horizontal line inside the circle sinks beneath the water, and in its place a new line appears, higher than the old one, as if the city itself is marking the next level. Officially, the expedition was evacuated because of a sudden local flood. The reports say the excavation was closed, the area was unstable, and further work was impossible. But 1 month later, satellite images showed that the place had changed. The salt plain had become smooth. Every trace of the dig had vanished. No pits, no equipment, no camp. Only in the center of the dried basin, a dark circular mark had appeared, like an eye. A year later, one of the archivists working with the expedition materials found a tiny note beside the city on the ancient coastline map. Earlier they had mistaken it for a name, but it was not a name. It was a warning. We did not live by the sea. We lived above it,